Good evening, everybody. I am just waiting to see some other people join in and wait a few moments before we start. I think we've got about 3 minutes before we start. Good evening. It's good to see at least some viewing numbers start to increase. Good evening. We will start in about a minute's time. Good evening, everybody. Well, I think we're going to make a start because it's 7 o'clock on the dot. And in normal times, when we're in a village hall somewhere, it might sound and look very different as people start milling around and coming in. But online, I'm keen to keep this to time, so we'll make a start. But it's good to see folks joining in. I can see the number of viewers going up. So welcome to the very first of these virtual public meetings that are taking place over the next 2 weeks across the constituency. This one tonight is for Lochaber and the Small Isles, although we won't kick you out if you've sneaked in from elsewhere in the constituency. My name is Kate Forbes, and I am, of course, the SNP candidate for the constituency of Lochaber and Badenoch, and standing to be re-elected. Now, this is the first of these events, as I mentioned, so we'd appreciate your patience and perhaps your feedback afterwards as well, because I'm doing some of the technical stuff and doing the answering of questions as well to keep it ticking over. So hopefully it works tonight on YouTube, which allows more people to watch than if it was just straight on Facebook. Normally, of course, we'd be doing these in a village hall. I've got lots of memories of speaking in cold village halls from whether it's Balhulish or Kinlochleven or in Fort William itself. And although we can't do that this time round, I think it's still important from a democratic point of view that we ensure there's still a chance to hear directly from candidates and also to ask questions and to get answers. So I'm keen to ensure that democracy continues in some way, but also it protects people's health as well. So thank you for bearing with us. Now, we have asked for some questions in advance, and thank you for sending in those questions. We've got quite a few questions. I'll get through as many as I can. Somebody else, not me, has helpfully gone through the questions and grouped them into particular themes. So those are broadly around public services, so education, healthcare, the economy and tourism particularly, the environment, and then infrastructure as well, which I know is an issue of particular interest in Lochaber. If you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, so if you didn't manage to email in already, then you can post a question on the Facebook event, and somebody from my campaign team is keeping an eye on the Facebook event, and they will ping them over to me, questions or comments. So you can post those just now as we are speaking. As I said, I'll try and keep this under an hour because we've got less interaction this way. It's largely just my voice. Perhaps we'll find a way of bringing other people in to ask their questions live. But for now, it will just be me responding to written questions. And I'm sure you don't want to listen to my voice for more than an hour. So I'll try and keep it to under an hour. And of course, after the event, if you feel like it's prompted more questions or more comments, and you feel some questions haven't been answered, then you can fire an email to me. So the email address is info@kate-forbes.scot, and we'll reply. That's all the housekeeping messages. And I think we are now good to officially start. So starting from the top, I'll say a few words about the election, and then we'll dive straight into some of the questions. Good. Well, welcome tonight. This is a very critical election. I'm sure for some of us, an election is the last thing on our minds just now, with COVID, with the restrictions being relaxed and the vaccination programme progressing. But a lot hangs on this election. This election is hugely important, if not one of the most important elections in Scotland's history, which is because there is so much at stake. Of course, we've all been through a very difficult and in many cases heartbreaking year. I certainly know from my inbox how many individuals have feared for their loved ones, have been worried about their jobs and their businesses, and it has been a tough and difficult year. And in that, I think it's fair to say that leadership has never mattered so much. Leadership has mattered at every twist and turn of the pandemic, and leadership will matter hugely when it comes to economic recovery. Now, there is much to be hopeful about as the vaccination programme remains on track, with over half of Scotland's population now vaccinated, and the First Minister laying out just yesterday, I think it was, further restrictions being relaxed this Friday, with a lot of restrictions being relaxed in a fortnight's time. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But of course, with that light at the end of the tunnel, now more than ever, we have some choices to make. We need the experience, the trustworthy and the competent leadership to guide us, but we also need to be clear in our own minds as we go to the polls in just over 3 weeks' time, what kind of future we want for Scotland and what kind of future we want for the Highlands. And certainly from my perspective, the recovery of the Lochaber economy is an absolute top priority, because the pandemic has left countless businesses on their knees, unemployment in Lochaber has risen, and young people are struggling to get on the housing ladder. And my commitment at the start of the next parliamentary term is to tackle each of those challenges in the same way as I have tackled challenges in Lochaber over the last few years, listening by being at countless surgeries and answering countless emails, listening first, and then working with you through the ups and the downs until the problem is fixed. And I know that there are many problems in Lochaber that still aren't fixed. There is a lot of work still to be done. But that's the order that I think is important: to listen, to act, and to keep going until it's fixed. And doing that, we have made some real progress on difficult issues that seemed insurmountable a few years ago, And yet now we can see solutions. If you take rural tourism as one example, with huge amounts of congestion in Malig, Arsay, Glenfinnan and Glenetiv. Over the last few years, we established the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, which has released funding for improvements to car parking and toilets in Arsay and Malig, as well as Glenfinnan, and there's work ongoing in Glenetiv. Or you take transport. I know the 82 is the bane of everybody's lives, and progress has not been as quick as I'd have liked. I would have liked to see a new road going through Fort William to relieve congestion, and certainly more work when it comes to dealing with some of the issues along the wider stretch of the A82. But over the last 5 years, there has been work which has progressed on the Tarbert to Inverarnon stretch in particular, and short-term works in Fort William. The same would probably be applied to the Belford, and I know that there's a question probably later on about the Belford. In fact, I think one's just come in about the Belford. Again, an example where progress has not been as quick as it should be and as quick as it needed to be. But there is a commitment there with the land secured that we need to get a new hospital up as quickly as possible. And then the last one is economy and jobs. You know, it's difficult to remember to 5 years ago, but 5 years ago, I remember speaking at a hustings in Fort William, where I was asked what I was going to do about the smelter, because all the jobs were on the line at that point with no buyer. Now, the smelter is back in the news again, but we have made progress since the last election with the fact that those jobs have been protected. Those jobs have been saved. So those are just some of the examples where working together, we've made progress. Is there more to do? Absolutely. But ultimately, in order to make that progress, it needs to be an accountable politician that listens, and then a willingness to work with the community to resolve things. I said at the beginning that this is one of the most important elections in Scottish history, and so much hangs on its outcome. But at its very heart, when we take a step back from the local issues and even the national issues, at its very heart, it comes down to one very simple question, and that is who should decide our country's future. Now, more than ever, is a time for experienced leadership and government as we continue with the most important task that we have, which is Scotland's recovery. And this election can be the one in which Scotland overwhelmingly and decisively shows that it wants to choose a better path for our future and wants the powers to shape that future. And that means the people of Scotland having the right to decide their own future in an independence referendum when the COVID crisis is over. With independence, we have that ability to shape our recovery, and we'll have a recovery that is made in Scotland with the powers to build a fairer and more prosperous country. So those are some of the issues at stake in this election, and those are some of the issues that I'm sure will be raised over the course of the questions. So I'll now move to some of the questions, and I think some comments are coming through, which is good. So the first area of questions are around health, education and local services. We've had some people asking to remain anonymous and others that are not so worried. So I will just ask the question without aligning it to individuals. And the first question is around devolving power to West Highland communities, whether I'm in favour of breaking up Highland Council and devolving more power to West Highland communities. I think the answer to that is that I'm very much in favour of devolving more power to West Highland communities. I don't think it's all about structures. I think it's about making sure that local area committees, local representatives have the power and have the financial resources to actually deliver change. So structures are one thing, making sure that the structure of a local authority with all the HR and the financial support is smaller. That's one thing. But I think more importantly than that is making sure that West Highland voices are loud. Now, Lochaber has some brilliant councillors, but I know that they too are often frustrated by the lack of influence that they sometimes have in Inverness, not through lack of their effort, but because their voices are drowned out. And the other part to this is the fact that there is more and more funding available to go directly to communities. So I do think if you take something like the Crown Estate, the Crown Estate funding, which is based on coastline, is going to Highland Council, and it's absolutely essential that it's local communities, local groups that are able to access that funding, and that it doesn't come back to the West Highlands in a depleted form. There's now been 2 years of Crown Estate funding that could be unlocking huge opportunities in the West Highlands. The other part to that is to ensure that when it comes to area committees and councillors, they are able to represent local voices and do something about it rather than having to take it back to Inverness. So I'm very much in favour of giving the West Highland communities, West Highland representatives far more power. I don't think that necessarily means a big breakup of the local authority area, but I do think more needs to be done in terms of giving local councillors and indeed local community councils more teeth with more financial resources and more power to actually deliver solutions. Question number 2 is on the Belford. NHS Highland have had the new Belford site for 6 years. Why has there been no progress for the new hospital? And that's similar to another question that's just come in from the Facebook group, which is how do we ensure that the new Belford hospital is built? This has been going on for so long and we need to get it done now rather than just talking about it for another 5 years. Absolutely. I think looking back on the last 5 years, I have frustrations about things that have not been delivered as quickly as I would have liked them to have been delivered. And certainly there was much excitement at the beginning with the purchase of the new land, the establishment of a steering group, and yet that seems to have been hugely frustrating for some that sit on it. I think the answer to the question is twofold. Firstly, I have had a number of conversations with the Scottish Government over the years, but particularly in the last year. The Scottish Government are open and awaiting a proposal from NHS Highland for the new Belford. There has not been, up to this point, an actual submission of the business case for the new Belford. But the Scottish Government has said that they are ready and willing and will look out for that business case to be received. So the absolute priority must be to get that business case pinned down and ready to be submitted to the Scottish Government. There can be no funding, there can be no sign-off until that business case is submitted to the Scottish Government. And it needs to be submitted. It needs to be submitted sooner rather than later, because the longer that we wait, the more likely it is that there will be new challenges emerging with the other building works that are going on in the area. So in terms of how do we get this fixed, we've got to get that business case. To get the business case requires NHS Highland to treat this as an absolute priority, to recognise the time and the urgency that's required, and to get that business case agreed. I know that there are some outstanding issues in terms of the clinical model, so that needs to be resolved as a priority with everybody working together, those that work in the Belford right now and those that don't, working together to get the clinical model pinned down to allow the business case to go in ahead of October with the Scottish Government ready and waiting for that business case to be received. We cannot, I absolutely and utterly refute the notion that this needs to take another 5 years. It is taken far too long already, and it needs to be, those steps need to be resolved. Now, I know that some look at the Orkney model and say that that is a good model for us to replicate in Fort William, which I wouldn't disagree with. There is now, of course, an individual who was heavily involved with the Orkney build, now involved with NHS Highland, and who will lend his support and involvement to the Fort William, to the new Belford. So I think there's a better leadership from NHS Highland, even in the last few months, but leadership will be redundant if we don't nail those timescales in terms of getting a submission in to the Scottish Government. Okay, just looking at what other questions are coming in. I'm seeing the numbers of viewers fluctuate. There's a question here about ASN children. Are there plans in place to upgrade the support for ASN children in Lochaber? They receive significantly less support than children in other parts of the Highlands. Inverness has Drummond, Dingwall has St Clements. I appreciate building a school may not be financially viable, but there is capacity within existing schools to set up a support base, and there is great demand for this service. I know that ASN often gets no support at all because of the very limited resources that mainstream schools have, and that can only go to children with the most significant needs. Thanks for that question, and the questioner goes into a bit more personal details, which I won't share at their request. But I think that is a hugely important question, and it's one that I know has been debated over the last few years in Lochaber, particularly with the proposals by Highland Council a few years ago to cut ASN provision. And there was a huge fight that went in at the time. There was an argument about funding and financial resources. But when it comes to ASN provision, there are statutory responsibilities and legal requirements by any local authority to provide adequate ASN support. Now, I am more familiar with St Clements in Dingwall than Drummond, and I know that there is a general push against building standalone ASN schools. But I think the questioner's question about using capacity within existing schools is a really important one. And I think on that, I could go into detail about the various statutory requirements for ASN support, but I think putting that to one side, there's clearly a need for more in Lochaber, and because it's a Highland Council issue rather than a Scottish Government issue, that is something that if re-elected, I would be very happy to arrange meetings with Highland Council and perhaps some individuals from Lochaber who have a direct involvement in this, either as teachers or as parents with ASN, children with ASN needs, to look at what's possible in Lochaber and what more needs to be done in Lochaber. Okay, I will move on from that onto economy and tourism, because there are some more questions there. So the first one is about, some of these were submitted before the First Minister's update last week on, yesterday rather, on travel and lockdown restrictions. So it's a question here: why has no clarity been given to the islands ahead of tourism reopening on the 26th of April? So yesterday it was confirmed that the islands, who had been heavily consulted in the last few weeks, would remain at the same level as the mainland in order to allow for travel between local authority areas. So at the moment, because some islands are in a lower level, or if they were going to move to a lower level, then there would be restrictions on travel. And while there was a number of different opinions on the travel requirements of the islands, with some favouring islands going down to a lower level so that there could be more in-house visiting and more freedoms, others were quite clear that the island's economy depends on travel from the mainland. So the update yesterday was that the islands would remain at the same level as the mainland to allow for that travel, but that we would collectively be looking to accelerate our transition out of lockdown so that we can all enjoy more freedoms. There's another question that's quite similar, which is: when will cross-border travel be permissible, and why has the Scottish Government not announced that yet? And again, yesterday there was an update on that. So the government have announced that there will be cross-border travel between England, Wales, and Scotland from the 26th of April, and that we will revisit Northern Ireland as soon as possible because Northern Ireland are reviewing their own travel requirements. Their own lockdown requirements over the coming days. So that will be reviewed, but that hopefully gives, particularly the tourism industry, the chance to plan ahead for the 26th of April, and also for those of us who have friends and relatives elsewhere in the UK as well. This probably ties in quite neatly to the next question, which is about dirty camping, and the fear perhaps from some that with the unlocking of restrictions, there will be far more people coming to travel to the Highlands and Islands from other parts of the country looking for their staycation. And last year, there were some real challenges, particularly in the hotspots of Arisaig, to name just one, amongst others. There were some others as well. So there's been a lot of work over the winter period to try and resolve this and to prepare for what is likely to be another busy summer, particularly because international travel is not permitted quite yet. Over the winter period, Highland Council, of course, have done some work to recruit rangers, and they have agreed on various projects getting more funding. So their visitor management plan, which was signed off with their own budget, has investment for road management, parking, rangers, which I mentioned already, toilets, waste management, as well as some other specific investment in hotspots: Glencoe, Glenetiv, Arisaig, Morar and Malig. We also, from a Scottish Government perspective, have been convening a group of key tourism sector representatives to ensure that there is a plan in place. So that includes local authorities, that includes Visit Scotland and others, to make sure that there is a plan in place to manage visitors that come. And Visit Scotland have done a huge marketing campaign to promote slower and more responsible tourism that leaves no trace, which is aimed at perhaps the more irresponsible campers from the Central Belt and elsewhere, I hasten to add, who might have been responsible for some of the irresponsible behaviour last summer. So the test of all that will be in the next few weeks, I'd imagine, when more people start to travel. But right now, there has been a lot of work, a lot of investment, and a lot of collaboration to try and prepare this summer in a way that didn't take place last summer. And it is likely that we will see a very strong staycation market. I also wrote quite recently to Police Scotland, so to the local Chief Inspector of Police Scotland, about the concerns in Lochaber around visitor management. And the Chief Inspector, Jen Valentine, wrote back in terms of what the police are doing as well to manage the increase in travellers. Okay. Right. Next question is a question about, I'll read it out. What can be done to control the proliferation of Airbnb properties throughout the Highlands, but particularly in towns like Fort William, where there is a drastic shortage of affordable living accommodation? The soundtrack to a summer evening in Fort William is the sound of wheelie suitcases being dragged around by bewildered tourists following the sat nav on their phones. So what can be done to limit the proportion of Airbnb properties versus residential properties in a given area? And what can be done to manage the balance of residential amenities in any particular housing estate, village area? For example, an elderly person surrounded by Airbnb properties deprived of any neighbourly input. It is an area of concern. It's an area of concern not just in the Highlands, but obviously in Edinburgh as well. And some areas in the West Highlands have some of the highest percentages of Airbnbs to domestic dwellings. What can be done? Well, just before the Parliament went into recess, there was a piece of legislation that was passed to allow local authorities to create control zones. So where the percentage of Airbnbs are higher than they should be, and when they are having a negative impact on the local area, then a local authority can designate smaller control zones. And that passed. There was another element to the legislation which hasn't been passed because it is being subject to a working group with representatives from the industry and others. And it's the short-term lets legislation, looking at ways of ensuring that there is a level playing field when it comes to health and safety requirements for all short-term lets. So some big hotels have to, or small hotels have to meet certain health and safety requirements. Those same requirements don't apply to smaller short-term lets. And so the legislation was designed to try and create a level playing field of health and safety. It also allowed local authorities to take further action if there were specific issues around antisocial behaviour or other things. So those are the proposals in terms of dealing with the issue. Of course, for some, a short-term let is a means of earning additional income, which allows them to stay in the Highlands. So I think it's really important that we don't tar everybody with the same brush because there's Highland hospitality is renowned and we want to keep it renowned. And we want to ensure that it does continue to meet that high level, high playing field. Okay. Moving on, you'll be pleased to know we've got two further sections to ask on environment and rural affairs. Right, there's another one there on littering, particularly along roadsides and dirty camping hotspots, which is a huge issue. I feel like every time I drive down a main road, it feels like the littering has vastly increased, which is very disrespectful to local areas and also a burden on the taxpayer because it means that that litter needs to be picked up or cleaned up by using our public services. When if people were more responsible and more caring about our environment, that shouldn't be happening. Of course, there are fines in place, but if people are throwing litter out of their car, it can be very difficult to find them. Although somebody was suggesting not that long ago that there are new cameras that apparently you can put along roadsides and pick up if people are chucking their rubbish out the window and pick up their license plate. Anyway, another question on environment and rural affairs is on rewilding, which I know is an area that's an issue that's been catching perhaps more public attention in the last few years. And I think there's a huge difference between rewilding in terms of recognizing that a location was never wild to begin with, but wanting to invest in improving biodiversity, and the opposite view, which is the assumption that the Highlands is a wild landscape, which is something that I would not agree with. I think that the Highlands is a product of its history a product of choices and policy decisions that have been made over the years. And actually, our focus should be on repeopling the Highlands and ensuring that there is biodiversity to support that. I certainly think when it comes to rewilding that local communities need to be part of the discussion, and shouldn't be subject to decisions made by others, particularly absentee landlords. And I can think of a number of examples with farmers and crofters finding out to their surprise that rewilding was going on and it having an impact on their own flocks and livestock. So, in terms of rewilding, I'm fully on board with investing in our natural environment. I think that we have a great natural asset in our environment, and that's why our food and drink and our tourism is so world renowned. But I think everything needs to be seen through the lens of repeopling and ensuring that there are thriving communities that can earn a living and stay here alongside that investment in biodiversity. And rewilding too often sounds like the Highlands is a barren landscape devoid of people. Well, a good learning for the next public meeting. It's quite a long time to be talking and probably quite a long time to be listening as well. So anybody that's stuck through so far, I'm very impressed, and perhaps for the next one, we'll try and get some others speaking as well. So the last section is about housing and infrastructure. There's a question there about second homes and short-term lets, which I think I've probably responded to. I think when it comes to housing and affordable housing, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And part of that is building more houses, building more affordable homes. And that's not the only answer, but it's a big part of the answer. And there's been a lot of new homes built in Lochaber over the last few years. The SNP have built 97,000 or delivered 97,000 affordable homes since 2007. And our commitment is to deliver 100,000 affordable homes over the next 10 years. And I certainly want to see a lot of those new homes built in the West Highlands. We know that the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, which was established over the last few years, has been instrumental in opening up new plots of land to deliver more affordable homes, particularly in the Highlands and Islands. So that is also something that I support, because there clearly are greater infrastructure costs. And so ensuring that there's a supply there of affordable homes, that allows people to access a home in whatever stage they're at. So social rent, homes for social rent, as well as homes with shared equity schemes, also the self-build loan fund to allow people to build their own homes if they have land themselves. So I think that's part one, is the supply of more affordable housing and ensuring that people can actually access it. But there's other things that need to go alongside that, because supply is not enough if the homes that you're building just become empty second homes. And that's why I think it needs to go hand in hand with more disincentives to reduce the number of second homes. Now, a few years ago, we created the additional dwelling supplement, and that is a surcharge on second homes. So if you buy a second home, you pay additional tax to try and disincentivize second homes. And right now in the Highlands, all council tax revenue that comes from second homes is reinvested in affordable housing. It's ring fenced for affordable housing in the Highlands. So that would be second part, disincentivizing through taxation and other things, regulation, the number of second homes. But the third area is around ensuring that there are jobs available, because part of the problem is the gap between the average house price and the average income is too great a gap. So making sure that we support people to live and work in the Highlands, and the Rural Entrepreneur Fund has just been announced, and that is a fund that directly tries to support entrepreneurs in the Highlands and Islands to set up business here, or to move here to set up their business, or to support entrepreneurs that are already here in the Highlands. So those would be three quick suggestions on what we need to do to secure more affordable housing alongside tackling second homes and short-term lets. Okay, there's two questions here about ferries. One, how can CalMac better serve remote and rural communities, and particularly when it comes to freight? And another question around the ageing fleet and ensuring that there are no further delays to delivering new ferries. On the first one, so this is probably a question that originates with the Small Isles, because I know that there's been long-standing issues there in CalMac changing or appearing to change the requirements for managing small freight. And that's an issue that's also been replicated in RASI. I think the first point is that they need to listen. And too often it feels like some of these decisions are made without without consultation. I think that was certainly the feeling recently when it came to the Small Isles and the questions around freight. They need to listen, and they need to listen carefully before they make decisions. The second thing is that rules, perhaps made in Guruk or elsewhere, that look reasonable on paper may not work in practice when it comes to serving communities in remote and rural locations. And if they're not going to work in those remote and rural locations, then they need to be reconsidered. And I think that's, again, another issue that has emerged with the changes to freight. They absolutely need to make sense in practice, not just on paper. And in terms of further delays delivering new ferries, well, the ferries need to be delivered. Yeah, they need to be delivered. If I go back again to one of the first issues that cropped up at the beginning of this last parliamentary term, it was the Kursk being redeployed. Now, there's been a lot of work over the last few years to try and get a reasonable service between Mallaig and Armadale, but clearly what it needs is its own service, its own vessel. And that will come with the new vessels being freed up. The delays are horrendously disappointing and unfortunate, but the vessels are still being worked on, which means those two vessels are still in the pipeline and will be delivered, which will then free up other vessels to serve that Mallaig Armadale route. And then the last question, which definitely will allow us to finish before the hour is up, is perhaps one that you think should have been one of the first questions, which is, what improvements will you secure for the A82 over the next parliamentary term? Two answers to that. First, progress in Tarbert to Inverarnon. I know that stretch is not in my constituency, and I know it's not in Lochaber, but it serves, there's a lot of Lochaber residents that use the A82, and that Tarbert to Inverarnon stretch is horrendous. And work has continued. It's a huge engineering project in terms of the improvements between Tarbert to Inverarnon. They have to be delivered. So I suppose point number one is that they have to be delivered over the next few years. The second thing is the congestion through Fort William. When first looking at this a few years ago, there was a choice between short-term measures and long-term measures. The short-term measures have largely been exhausted. Anything more when it comes to short-term measures, you might as well be starting to invest in long-term measures. So I think it needs the long-term measures. That will never be delivered overnight. There is a STPR process ongoing just now. And certainly the Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government are in no doubt about what I think is one of the biggest priorities for infrastructure over the next few years. But it needs the substantial investment, it needs the substantial plans, and we should be in no doubt that there's probably a lot of disagreement around what those long-term measures should be in terms of improving the 82 and the congestion through Fort William, in terms of the different routes. So all of that needs to be resolved, but at least we have made it may feel slow, but we have made some progress on the A82, even if it's just exhausting the short-term measures so that the only options are the long-term measures. And that needs to be a priority. My one consolation in all of this is that it's taken 40 years to even get to this point, which is ridiculous. But if I go back to my opening remarks, I know that there are still problems that haven't been fixed. But the way to fix them is not to give up and to keep pressing for them to be fixed. And that's certainly my commitment on that. So I think those were the questions, and I'm just going to check my phone to see if anybody's firing in any other questions. And I think we have picked up any other questions that have emerged, which takes us quite neatly to the 45-minute mark. And a sincere thank you to everybody who has tuned in for the first of these virtual meetings. I think it's shown what works and perhaps things that we could do differently from next time. If you're watching and want to fire in some suggestions for what to do differently next time, then let us know. But I hope that you're enjoying the same sunshine and the same sunset in Lochaber as I am just now. And of course, if there are any questions or you weren't happy with any of the answers that you got, then fire in an email, and I'd be happy to look at the points you raise and see if I can answer it in a better or in a different way. Meantime, thanks very much, and hopefully see you all later, even if it's just virtually on the virtual campaign trail. So thanks very much for coming. Thanks for giving me your time. We'll be running virtual town halls in some of the other parts of the constituency as well. So if you've got any friends or family anywhere else, let them know and invite them along. Thanks very much. Bye.